My name's Lieutenant Colonel Andy Child. We've got Major Will Peltor with us, so thank you for the introductions and thank you for having us here today. It's a real privilege to be asked to speak. What we're going to talk about for the next 35 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards, is about how the UK Armed Forces, we'll start with at the beginning, but effectively the military adapted to COVID. And the reason Will and I are here is because in my previous job, I worked in the 3-star headquarters for the Army's general who was responsible for the response to COVID. I'm now working as the commanding officer of Wales University Officer Training Corps, so I work out of Cardiff. So I'm in a slightly different job now. But Will, importantly, works in 160 Brigade, which is the Welsh Brigade, and was fundamental in the delivery of the COVID response in the local area. So we will start at the political level and then take the conversation down into the sort of local delivery, which will be a lot more tangible for the audience, and hopefully you'll be able to recognise some of the things we talk about. So, Amy, if I could ask for the first slide, please, that would be fantastic. It might take a few minutes to load up. But whilst we're waiting for the slides to load up, if you do have any questions, please pop them into the chat bar. Will and I will endeavour to answer them as we go along, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. I'll provide a caveat at the front, which is the talk we're going to give you is not the UK's formal post-operational report findings. We're going to talk about our personal level, what we observed, and how that leadership and response of the military was enacted from our own observations. What's also important to recognise is it's kind that you've asked us to speak, but we realise we're not the experts on the COVID response. We were an organisation that came to assist the national response, and many of the delegates here were fundamental in that. So please accept our observations from the military point of view, noting that we worked alongside you and supported you in the delivery. But that leads me into the first point of the talk, which is about how the political appetite has fundamentally changed with UK government and how it uses its armed forces. So I think it's fair to say that the armed forces are the national reserve, so a service of last resort. But what we've seen over recent years, and not just with a COVID response, but prior to that, is a real appetite of our prime ministers and our governments, and that's UK government and then in the devolved nations, to look at the armed forces as another first responder. And that's not what we're necessarily configured for. But because we have mass, because we have people who are trained, it becomes very tempting to look at the military as a very quick win for our politicians to say, let's bolster up whatever's needed. And I've been involved in flooding previously and other UK resilience activities. So we now have something which is called Standing Joint Command UK. That sits in Aldershot. That was part of the organisation I was sat in my last job. And there's a real appetite daily for the government, when something's happening, UK government, to say, what can the military do? Whereas previously that would have been exhaust all other options, and that's where the military can then start to support. So it's a mindset shift in our political headshed, and that's not a problem, but it has changed how we as defence do our business. The next thing is that all through any challenge or UK resilience, that the government are weighing up what is the effect on the economy, the effect on the public order of the population and the public health, and you will know better than I as informed delegates that those three areas fundamentally weigh on our leaders' minds about where we may want to contribute more help. The military is not configured for the economy or for the public health in the same way, but it can help with public order, and with the mass of our soldiers and the some of the skills we have, we can then assist other first responders in what they do. So there's a subtle change in how people wish to use the armed forces. And if you can see the slide now, which I hope you can, you'll see that it's got a picture of some soldiers marching outside Buckingham Palace, and it said Headquarters Home Command. So Headquarters Home Command is a 3-star headquarters where I was working in my last job. And a 3-star just reflects the seniority of the general, the leader who's responsible for that area. Home Command covers all UK home activity, everything from recruiting into the army, and I'll talk a bit of that in a minute, to the career pathways, to the infrastructure, the support we deliver, and then the delivery of resilience and MACA tasking, so military assistance to the civilian authorities. And that is seated with the Standing Joint Command, who I've mentioned previously, who are effectively supporting the resilience of the nation. And that's the union, and then in the devolved nations. And each devolved nation wishes to use the military in different ways and has a different appetite, which we'll be able to touch on later. The general you see on the right of the slide is General Sir Ty Urch. He was Commander Home Command through the pandemic, and he had two jobs: Commander Home Command and then Commander of the SJC. And when the COVID outbreak started, I was actually in his office as it was becoming more real, and I remember briefing him one evening, and he started sitting down in his chair and said, "I'm feeling less comfortable with people around me. I think we all need to go home. We need to start this action early." And actually, as a three-star general, although it hadn't, lockdown was actually another 2 weeks to follow, he was very quickly starting to send his people home and take the initiative early to set the conditions to make sure people were first of all safe, but his headquarters could keep operating. But General Sir Ty Urch was knighted last year for his leadership through the military response to COVID. He's now retired, but he was the leader throughout, and he became full-time commander, Standing Joint Command. So all the other areas of Home Command, which included the careers, the inflow to the army, somebody else was brought in to take over that, another general, to make sure the army could continue running. And General Ty switched solely to running the Armed Forces response, and that Armed Forces was tri-service, so Navy, Air Force and Army. Quite interestingly, I've put up a quote there from one of our soldiers, which highlights, I think, quite effectively why the government are quite keen to lean on the military nowadays. And that's the fact that many of the skill sets that we put our soldiers, sailors and Air Force through are generic training, which enables them to adapt and adjust very quickly. And that's both individual resilience, but organizational resilience, which allows you to adjust where you would want to go and what type of task we are supporting. And it was very clear at the beginning that this was a homeland resilience task for our first responders, the NHS, police, etc., to deal with, but the military could help somehow. So before lockdown had even started, contingency plans in the headquarters were being spun up to make sure people were thinking, how can we help? What do we need to do? And here brings in one of the first considerations, and this struck me at the very beginning. At no stage were our senior leaders or any members of the organisation willing to step outside what we were asking the public to do. And I think often people think that the military can operate with immunity. There used to be Crown immunity many years ago. That's long since gone. We adhere to the rules and regulations of our people, and that's only appropriate. But at no stage were the military looking to circumvent the force health protection and the rules that we were operating under as a nation, and that was on operations abroad as well. But operations had to continue. So I'll talk about operations in a few minutes, but that instantly posed a problem because we have an inflow. So we have about 10,000 soldiers in the army every year joining. That's because we have a lot leaving either through natural retirement or because they've decided to have a short-term career with us. But we have to recruit 10,000 a year. That's a massive pipeline of training. And we all know if you stop the factory line and then restart it again, it uses a lot of energy and causes gaps in the logistical chain. So at all levels, less frontline operations, we halted the machine. The military came to a standstill, and we reconfigured and quickly tried to work out how we were then going to go forward. The next thing, which was incredibly noticeable as one of the staff, I was a staff officer working for General Ty, is how we reconfigured key personalities to do the new job and the new task in front of us. So decisions were taken. as to what we were going to continue doing and what we were going to stop doing, because it was still unknown how the military were to be used. And I actually went to the Army headquarters in Andover, usually about 2,500 people working there daily, and there was about 25 of us in a building, sat socially distanced, planning out what we were going to do next. And there was a priority list taken at the very highest level of operations, all the way down to training, career management, and various other activities. That was prioritized, and we were told, if you're in this area, okay, that's going to continue. We will prioritize our support to you, and in other areas, wait out for more information. That the rollout of laptops was rapidly increased to get people operating again. As is with any rollout of IT, it goes to the seniors first. So the people with the great ideas were generating ideas and firing those out, but those at the lower levels didn't necessarily have the ability to enact those ideas as quickly. So it was clunky, but people started supporting the effort very, very quickly. And then RESCRIPT was the name of the operation given to support the government in our response to COVID. The headquarters for that was in Home Command, which was in Aldershot. All the main staff had been sent home, but then one by one we configured a new headquarters, which became about 300 people in headquarters alone, operating daily, making sure that we could then get the army running again. Full self-protection measures were in place. People were allowed in at certain times and out. Hand washing, all those basic measures were there, but that was enabled them to operate. And people were asked to be separated from their families, and we effectively mobilised individuals to sit in parts of the UK to keep the machine going. Some of the low-level observations and ways we enabled activity is if we were in a training camp or a big camp, and that training was deemed critical, it was slowly started again, but we would then keep people socially distanced, but keep them confined to camp. That became incredibly difficult when somebody thought they were only on a 2-week course, and they were going to have weekends to go home, but all of a sudden it was a 4-week course and they weren't allowed to leave. So tensions were instantly brought on some of the personnel who were deployed. People who were on longer courses, their courses were cut shorter. They were then compressed in time, and we passed a training risk over to the subsequent formation they were part of. So it was identified where risk could be mitigated and where risk could be carried forward. When it came to how we interacted with government, there was a small team who were part of the main planning machinery, and the advance warning we got as a military was sometimes at the time it was being delivered on the news. So I think many of us would recognise now that there was quite a reactive response to COVID. That was also at the very top of our organisation as well. We're having to respond to how the politicians were deciding at that moment in time to reconfigure. So it wasn't as though we were able to preempt with all the decisions, but what we could do is contingency plan to make sure that when something was taken, we could react quite quickly to that. There were tensions, and there were also times where some people in the military were found not to be adhering to those COVID rules. So the reputation of the organisation was fundamental in people's minds as well. And it goes back to what I said at the beginning. We are part of the public. The only reason we can operate legitimately is with the consent of our people, and that's the public at home. So making sure that our soldiers understood that at the lowest level was critical, and that becomes a real leadership task when you're a force of 80,000. But once again, although people often think the reputation is about safeguarding yourself from harm and making sure people don't find out your errors, this was about making sure we had public consent to continue to operate legitimately. So operations is the front end where people often think about the military, and particularly the army. And I'm going to focus in now on OPCBRIT. OPCBRIT is where we have troops based around the Russian border and in places like Estonia. So you can look at these on the news, and you'll see that over recent events, we've increased the numbers of troops we have abroad. But this has been ongoing for some time. What's really interesting about the operational vignette, which I'll give you now, is that this wasn't British troops standing alone. We were working as a multinational force with battalions, with nations from all around the world, and they all had their own independent force health protection rules. But we didn't have the luxury of being able to expand the space they could operate in. So as people were training for operations, we'd have to take greater risk at the distance they could operate with, noting that the vehicles you see on screen there, which are armoured fighting vehicles, have to get 7 or 8 soldiers in the back. We can't increase that size, so they're operating in very small confinements. So as and when we would have isolated troops before they deploy somewhere, they'd all come together very quickly. So managing the spread of any disease subsequently is challenging. There was a unit who were preparing to go out to Opcabrit. Their pre-deployment training was some in Germany, some in South Wales in Castlemartin, some on Salisbury Plain. But before they did every single one of those events, those soldiers had to isolate for a week period, then deploy on the exercise, then come back, isolate, and then go on to the next phase, which meant the 6-month deployment they were on abroad became a 9-month deployment, because 3 months leading up to that, they were effectively isolating from their families. And that brought great tension and pressure on people, and I'll more of that in a minute. Then fast forward to the deployment, they operated in a multinational camp. So the commander of the forward presence force had about 1,000 soldiers under his command, as well as others from other nations. COVID would spread like wildfire. Some people would feel the symptoms more severe than others. They had minimal ways to isolate them, but they had to make sure that the operational front end was continuing, that the presence of our forces on the Russian border was known, that the deployments were still active, and our capability was still there. So there was a constant rotation of personnel having to operate in a high-risk environment, but also making sure that we were safeguarding our people. So it's a constant rotation of personnel. That takes a heavy dose of leadership, a heavy dose of goodwill, and resilience of individuals to keep it. But one of the biggest factors that came out was actually the soldiers away were resilient and were understanding what they were doing. The biggest pressure came from home. And so the greatest risk that the commander forward was facing was the families at home, who were having to homeschool, having to have their children at home, and having less people around them to support them. So rotation of personnel back to the UK to look after families who were on breaking point had an operational impact forward, and that was something that took great management and great resource to do, because the troops would normally have a 2-week rotation where they come home. That was cancelled to make sure we didn't spread COVID between movements, so less moving parts. And so great attention was placed on people, and those soldiers were spending 9 to 12 months away from their families, for which something should have been a 6-month tour. Bore out of all of this was the respect for the person, understanding what people were able to do, measuring that, and then making sure that they were thanked in the smallest way, because behind every operational request is a human, in a person, and we have very little ways, like many people on here in your own organisations, of rewarding our people. But the basic courtesy, informing them and thanking them and celebrating the small wins, became more important than ever. But it was remembering the human that sat behind everybody became the biggest tension point. And actually our families were coping became the main reason and decisions for why operational tasks were being carried out. I'll hand over to Will now, who'll be able to talk about some of the more detailed aspects in Wales. Will.
Thanks, Colonel. Good afternoon, everyone. So as introduced, my name is Will, and I work in Headquarters 160th Welsh Brigade, Wales's Brigade, the headquarters of the British Army in Wales. And in this example, I'll hopefully provide you a short overview on how the British Army adapted to the changing environment of COVID here in Wales. Of course, as Colonel Andy touched on, this is just one very small piece in the overall massive jigsaw of the Welsh public sector's efforts during the COVID response. And while I'm on that theme, I just want to say my own diolch, thank you for getting our communities across Wales through the challenge of the last 2 years. So in terms of the brigade, 160th Welsh Brigade, and what its purpose is, well, it was an infantry brigade until a few years ago with sort of 2,500 soldiers. Now it's the headquarters of the British Army in Wales, focused on basing and infrastructure, ceremonial engagement, cadets, resilience, more to follow on that, and acting as sort of devolutions SMEs for the Army and MOD, amongst other things. To do these tasks, we have about 100 staff, a 50-50 between civil servants and military on a variety of terms of service. A bit about me in terms of context, so you know where I'm coming from. So in March 2020, I was the Chief of Staff for this brigade, 21 months into appointment, and then started, like you'll all probably remember where you were sort of January through to March 20, started to pick up in the news the sort of developing situation. I think by February half term, when that had been that horrendous weather across Wales, where resilience was at its foremost, we as a headquarters, just a bit like Colonel Andy was saying, started to sort of think about needing to get ahead and anticipate. So by March 20, the headquarters had worked to reinforce existing business continuity plans. And this was to ensure the headquarters could, through digital access, deliver its tasks, but also keep in touch and support each other as necessary. And this was in itself a significant piece of work by a range of people, meaning that everyone had a laptop, smartphone, or basic work phone with a defence email address and effectively access to what is called our defence gateway, which you can access from civilian website. Somehow, amazingly, we achieved this the day before the Prime Minister directed the lockdown. And from there, our head of our civil servants, an SEO, took on the responsibility of supporting those not directly related to resilience operations. And her role was key. And I then switched in to support her 10 weeks into the activation of JMC Wales to work on making sure that we had our business as usual tasks being rebuilt alongside sustaining our resilience operations. So a very busy slide, but effectively this is a slide which is in the sort of development of our post-op reports for JMC Wales for op RESCRIPT. And as I see in the chat and see the attendees, many of you will have been key to enabling us to even turn up to support these tasks. And effectively the story for us was we activated on the 19th of March, JMC Wales, Joint Military Command Wales, here in Brecon Barracks in the Keep, which was actually a regional control bunker many years ago. We effectively trebled in size in a fortnight. And by that time, we also had on standby available to support the First Minister in Wales's requirements, 750 men and women from a number of units, with more available on call. As you'll see, sort of as you go from left to right, by early April even, we had soldiers decontaminating and driving WAST ambulances, and Wales was the first to do this. And this would see other headquarters from across the defence coming to us and asking how WAST and JMC Wales had approached the training and the deployment on task. Other tasks followed, like mobile testing units, and of course, later stages of the response, the vaccination support force. Whilst their headquarters had conducted, obviously, a number of resilience exercises before COVID and supported real-time operations like Op Casula, Op Ismay, and activated for cautionary reasons on Op Tempora, a number of these tasks were certainly novel to us, and we were described as contentious because it's something that defence hadn't previously got itself involved with. And it took time for UK Defence to fully digest what it was getting itself involved with and what its duties and responsibilities were to ensure that we were ready to deploy, prepare, deploy and sustain our personnel on those tasks. It required a real change in MOD mindset, a rapid understanding of what was being asked in the situation, and moving forward. And being part of those emails and those phone calls and the sort of hearing and seeing the brigade commander explaining to the three-star headquarters why it was so important to be getting after these tasks was a real education. Other headquarters after, with JMC Wales and WAST having set the proven route and shown where we needed to be getting after, it was much easier for them. But we in Wales were very much at the vanguard of that. About 2,400 service personnel who supported throughout the pandemic 36 different MACAs, so military assistance to civil authority, as well as 22 military assistance teams. And then you've got the detail there, which again, this audience will be familiar with, and be clear that it's just a small percentage of what was actually achieved over the time, but gives a bit of data to what I've talked about in terms of the range of tasks we got after. So hopefully I've given a sense of the overall sort of story of how JMC Wales 160 Welsh Brigade sort of dealt with the initial stages and sort of the overall story of the COVID response, and some of the changes we had to consider and implement at the sort of R level, as sort of trailed by Colonel Andy at the sort of 3-star level. What I propose to do is to relate some of the actions we had to undertake to adapt to the situation using the leadership behaviours framework for the Welsh Public Service. And my hope is that I enhance it and I don't undermine it. And apologies in advance if I completely trash what Academy Wales has set out to do. So I'll start with the sort of core behaviours, and I'll sort of follow around some of the other areas within the time we've got. So learning and self-awareness. Obviously, for us all, it was an unprecedented situation against an unknown and consistently evolving threat. And the need to learn and be self-aware was really key. We inevitably made mistakes in the early days. And I think the honesty of making mistakes is something that sometimes we forget how important it is, because I think it sets the right mindset in an organization. So we were pretty honest with ourselves. We collectively reviewed performance. We spoke to people at all levels to check that what the plan was meant to do actually achieved that. And we encouraged people to be part of that plan. We also had a weekly lessons identified and learning process, and a very rapid feedback loop, far more rapid than I've seen in probably my whole career. Probably more rapid than even the learning that was going on in the campaigns of Iraq and Afghanistan, countering the explosive devices against our troops. We also reviewed activities to stop groupthink and that echo chamber, and really red teamed to make sure that the changes necessary to be implemented were. We also really encouraged military commanders, particularly liaison officers who will have been working with your organizations, to be as self-aware as possible, because in the military we're taught we're in command appointment, we have to own the problem and they own the solution. But that wasn't the case required across RESCRIPT and the pandemic response. We were there to play a very small part in supporting what was already in place, or enabling what was already in place. And that required self-awareness and a bit of learning from some liaison officers to make sure they didn't overstep the mark. I'll touch on that in other areas. Drive and resilience was obviously a key area, and because it was a marathon, not a sprint as well. It was extremely demanding set of novel tasks introduced, and as Kanani says, against some crazy timelines that even probably our most demanding exercises in peacetime, we probably wouldn't have thrown ourselves against. We had to set, therefore, a relentless pace, but make sure we were providing outlets to ensure that the engine of our people was then able to continue like that. And part of that, and it seems odd to talk about it in drive and resilience, but the importance of a vision and purpose was really key. We didn't really know where the end was going to be, and it's only really at this point, maybe we can talk with a bit of hindsight as we go into endemic and COVID recovery. But at that point, as we'll all probably remember, trying to find what the end state was, the destination, it was pretty difficult. But it was key to establish some interim objectives and timelines to maintain that momentum and morale. The other areas are sort of focusing on citizens and quality, and it seems odd again from a sort of military perspective to be talking about that. But as Colonel Andy said, we are just part of the public sector and part of the public, and therefore actually it's completely intuitive. And we were very conscious that we were supporting the Welsh Government and our communities across Wales. And we had to really get things right by tracking a high volume of data, some of which we'd never heard of before. I had never heard of the R rate, for example, until March 20, late March 20. and a whole host of glossary terms that we had to become amateur experts so that we understood and could translate that into what we were being expected to do, and therefore anticipate and shape our approach and policies, and making sure that we were effectively doing the right thing. We also needed to learn quickly and understand the nature of the emergency and response, and that flowed from getting after that data. And we had to think ahead. We had to really understand the environment which we were in and we thought we would be entering, so that we could understand the impact on society, our people, and, as Colonel Andy's again said, talked about, our families. We also use technology just as is very intuitive now, but in the early days, Defence was not using Teams or Skype or anything for big meetings. But we went from not using these headsets to using them in a space of 36, 48 hours and having meetings virtually of about 200 people, from private up to generals, which meant that they had information much quicker and therefore were able to make decisions much more effectively. And that sort of leads on to sort of champion innovation and change. So the situation was fluid and unfamiliar, and obviously we had to think outside the box. We had to support innovative ideas of leadership and management. It couldn't just be face-to-face anymore. We had to achieve the effect, but while social distancing. Technology helped. So when we were supporting WAST, our soldiers would use the internet apps to register when they were coming off shift, how much fuel was delivered for bays, and our trauma risk incident management procedures were used using technology. We also had to really understand risk and embrace it. We had to accept that whilst we mitigated so much, we couldn't allow risk aversion to stop us supporting our communities across Wales and those organisations who were doing that. Equally, we had to look at building collaboration and partnership. So usually in the armed forces, when we're going to operations, we'll have spent months beforehand working with the range of organisations and partners and stakeholders, so that when we go on to task, all those relationships are established and we understand different language and terminology. We obviously had to do that really quickly. And whilst we train across the sort of resilience community across Wales, there were obviously some organisations where with whom we had not worked before, and certainly in the level of detail that we ended up doing during RESCRIPT. And we trebled, as I said, in size in a fortnight, the headquarters. And so we had liaison officers not from Wales working across organisations in Wales. And we needed to create so it's one team, one fight. We found that there were those who were much more comfortable in those organisations, who may not have been more senior, perhaps more junior, but based on experience or youth, were more flexible. And we had to effectively sometimes change our team sheet to suit the task and requirement and not fit with rank and hierarchy. So changing the team sheet midway through the game was something that we had to be comfortable with. Political awareness and skill, which seems odd coming from soldiers, but Colonel Andy sort of touched on it even at the 3-star space. But COVID necessitated a devolved health emergency response, given that health is devolved. And that meant that UK Defence really had to understand the context of decision making much earlier. And effectively, what we did as a headquarters, working with Headquarters Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the English regions headquarters, is we worked to generate a common picture for the 3-star headquarters of what was going on across the UK, so that UK Defence could anticipate requirements, but also we could get ahead and see whether something that was required in London or the northeast of England might start to emerge as a requirement in Wales, and get ahead with asking for those resources. It was perhaps most challenging and satisfying at the same time, in terms of sort of responsibilities of making sure that we use UK Defence and that LO network to explain Wales's requirements and make sure that Wales got its fair share of resources, and in some cases greater. In terms of sharing leadership, as I touched on, it was a dispersed new team. We had to trust it, and we had to state and re-emphasize the vision and purpose, and then empower. Praise is really important. Again, Colonel Andy's touched on that, especially when people are working hard, but also holding people to account. Mistakes are going to be made, but we need to make sure we don't gloss over them. So when we learn from them, and alongside that, when you're doing change and having to deliver change massively, humility and integrity are gold dust. And I think it ensures that change is well received and well managed. And my final area is obviously strategic orientation. I've touched on it already, but a clear vision and purpose is paramount. For me, it informed the team, it assisted them in anticipating through strong analysis and horizon scanning what was going on. And with that clear strategy, clear goals, timelines, and measurements, I think it helped guide our organisation through the storm, changing direction as necessary. And more importantly, in resilience terms, how we go about recovery. And of course, that's key in any emergency response. So that concludes my piece. I'll hand over to Colonel Andy. Just once again, thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. Diolch.
So just trying to wrap up some of our key observations. So what? So first of all, we didn't really touch upon it in the talk, but the mobilisation of our reservists was a phenomenal success. Many people stopped their day jobs, they changed jobs, they put their combat clothing on, which they were already part of that organisation, and it really demonstrated the power of regional and local response. And we had many reservists across the nations who effectively mobilised for 6 months. So that was fantastic. What was also really fascinating at the political level is each of the devolved nations wanted something different. Their appetites to use the military were different. Sometimes it could be on a whim. In UK government, sometimes it could be on an instinct, but it meant everybody had to be quite reactive, but it had to be personalised. It had to be the response for that area, because we are different by our own nature. So we may wrap ourselves in the same cloth and look and sound the same, but that personal response is so important, and that goes back to the importance of reputation, because you may get it right in one side of the forest, but in the other side of the forest, people may view it differently. So this was at the back of everybody's minds, and hence why we have the local regional response areas, which allow a more personal response to not only the senior leadership, but what the people need. And then also the risk versus outputs. What risk were we prepared to take? What risk were we allowed to take? The two are fundamentally different. I would say the risk appetite of the military is often greater. We are willing to take risk. Our people are trained to take great risk in one end, and so sometimes it's just rowing back on that and saying, no, we need to make sure we are appropriate, and the risk we're taking is acceptable and not putting us out of kilter with society. Hence that tension. The appetite sometimes doesn't match what we wish to deliver. But all of this wraps into organizational resilience. So from the very beginning of people's careers within the military, it's about allowing that individual to become a resilient person, both in their mindset, empowering them to get on with their jobs. We are task focused, but making sure everything's coordinated. Letting people rehearse in quieter times, so when time is short or there's an emergency, you can respond. And that doesn't mean we're trained clinicians or our level of expertise in all areas is great. It's not. We're often lay people, but we like to be able to turn our hand to the support that's required at the time. And also the structures. The army is renowned. People think we're all hierarchical, and it's all about the officer at the top and the soldiers falling in line behind, and that is true to a certain extent, but we can rapidly change headquarters and staff as we need to, which is a beauty of the organization. But just knowing your people and knowing your tasks means that you can then operate outreach with independence. And I suppose one of the key things for resilience is just we're always planning for the next step. So what's the contingency? How do we communicate that? So we've got situational awareness, but thinking that when it's done, that it's not the end. And that can be quite difficult, because when you're a reserve with a national reserve, the armed forces, we've got to reconfigure quite quickly, which sometimes means breaking dependencies with the people at a time we don't want to, but that's because we've got to reset for the next tasks. I mentioned earlier about the reputational considerations. It really does matter, because without the trust of our population, we can't operate legitimately. It is so important for us, and we just can't operate outside public rules. And that just comes down to transparency and honesty. And the military always struggles with this, because we want people to know, but then we have a side where people can't get access to, and it feels like it's a dark area where we're trying to hold people at arm's length. We're not. We want to learn from our mistakes, and we do that. But it's making sure we can convey that to people in an honest and transparent way, both internally and externally. And then the final thing, which I hope we've got across, is just we are all human. So we do make mistakes. We do get things wrong. I think Will touched quite subtly on the energy that some of our liaison officers may have had. You will have all had different experiences. Some of your liaison officers will think they could have come in to save the world, and they're wearing a cape and being quite clunky and clumsy. Some will be more attuned to the diplomacy, but they're people who've been asked to change a job very quickly. But what they will bring with them usually is energy and a desire to get on with that. But we don't have everybody trained in every area all the time, but we'll throw workforce and give energy to a system to help that planning. But we get things wrong sometimes, but we need to remember there's a human behind everybody, and that's why we can't see what goes on behind closed doors, but families matter always. Everybody will need support at some point, so we just want to enable people to be their best, both the ones we're working with, but our soldiers. And that just boils down to the senior leadership team. So critical that they've got humility, integrity and empathy, because we need to get things right, but adjust when we don't get things right. And the organisation, the military, felt supported all the way through from the first responders, the governments we were working with, and that just allowed a more harmonious ability to support those people in the areas we wanted. That's it from us.